Thanks, Stephanie, and thank you everybody for being here today. Like Stephanie said, my name is Aimee Strang, and I'm the Assistant Dean of Curricular Assessment at Albany College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. And I would like to talk for the next hour or so about how to create meaningful rubrics. Specifically, when you're using a rubric, how to recognize the common flaws, how to describe good criteria for rubrics, how to write descriptions that really distinguish between levels of performance, how to use ExamSoft to assign grades to your rubrics, and finally, and probably most importantly, how to ensure that your rubric is really evaluating student learning. So with that, just some vocabulary. In ExamSoft, I call criteria what's labeled as rows. So hopefully most of you have had a chance to look at the rubrics in ExamSoft or use them. The criteria would be in the rows going down, and then the levels of performance are what they're calling performance levels. So just so we have using the same language. So I'm assuming that most of you have experience using them. If you don't, then you're probably very interested because you're listening to this webinar today. And rubrics are a very interesting tool. So there's a lot of benefits to rubrics. They are great assessment tools for performance assessment, and they provide authentic assessment, you know, the kind of buzzword with assessment. They're a great scoring guide, and they promote greater consistency, especially if you have multiple graders. They're great for formative assessment and guides for student learning. And so there's really a lot of benefits to using rubrics. But there's a big if there, and that if is if the rubric is written correctly. And as we'll go on, you'll see that there's lots of rubrics that are not written correctly and lots of improvements to be made. So I've set this webinar up in two different parts. The first part will kind of go through, you know, bottom to top, how to create a rubric from scratch. And the second part is kind of top to bottom, how not to create a rubric or how to approach a rubric if you already have one and you're looking to improve it. So if you don't have a rubric and you have an assignment and you're thinking of creating a rubric to assess student learning, the first thing you need to do is almost a pre-rubric step. You have to think about what is the assignment. So this is where we think about the focus on the learning, not the activity. Start with the course objectives and create an assignment that actually will have the student demonstrating that they understand or can do or are performing, they know, they have the, you know, attitude, whatever you're measuring. The assignment has to be something that actually has the student demonstrating that to you. If they don't, then it's basically engaging busy work, and no matter what kind of rubric you make, it won't be reliable because it won't be valid because it's not measuring student learning. So as an example, I teach a class called current trends in academic health, and one of the learning objectives for that course is to analyze current trends that affect faculty and institutions in academic health professions. And so I wanted to be kind of an engaging class, and I have students work in groups to do things, and I thought, well, there are two assignments I could give them to do this, and one might be a Jeopardy game, you know, where they're kind of, you know, showing all the different trends in academic health and, you know, talking about them, and the other could be to do a poster presentation on, you know, trends in academic health. So they're both really great ideas, but they're only valuable if whatever they're doing within the game or within the poster is showing that they can actually analyze trends. So if they end up just making a Jeopardy game that lists trends and, you know, different kinds of trends, if you're familiar with Jeopardy, or a poster presentation that just lists a lot of information about the trends, then the rubric is really going to assess the assignment and not assess their learning. So I guess this is the first thing I would ask you to consider before you even look at your rubric is the assignment appropriate? So if it is, then the next thing you do is you think about how is the student demonstrating that they're learning? What are you going to be looking for? What's that evidence? And that evidence we're going to call criteria. So criteria has to be something that you can name and you can define and you can describe and you can observe it. If you can't do any of those, then you really have to think about what you really mean for that criteria. Because if it's kind of fuzzy to you when you're writing the rubric, it's even more fuzzy when you try to use the rubric or someone else tries to use it to assess a student with it. So it has to be extremely clear. Criteria also have to have some kind of variation along a continuum. In the health sciences, this is sometimes tricky because some of the things we look for are checklists. So yes, no, can they do it? Yes, no. And there's a place for that. But if there is no, if it's one of those and if there's not a continuum, then you shouldn't be trying to create a rubric for it. You should be creating a checklist for it. Another thing you need to make sure is that your criteria are unidimensional. So that means that you're only measuring one aspect for each criteria. For example, another course that we teach in a lab is the students have to triage a patient and provide an appropriate level of care. And they do this with simulated patients. And so some of the criteria might be, if they're going to end up triaging, then how are they collecting that information, the history, how are they collecting the medication history, how are they actually making the decision when they triage, and how do they communicate that to the patient? So those might be my 4 criteria, and then I would describe what that looks like along the continuum from very good to not very good. And if, for example, in the communication, I had verbal communication and nonverbal communication, that wouldn't be the best criteria, because if a student is doing well with verbal but not good with nonverbal, there's kind of not a way for them to tell, and vice versa. So make sure that your criteria are really clear and only measuring one thing. Some people ask, how many criteria should I have? And I think that's a personal decision. I think it depends a lot on what you want to measure, and it depends a lot on what's important. If something is not important, don't waste your time making a big rubric to measure it. As a rule of thumb, I think once you get more than 8 or 9 criteria, if it were my assignment, I would start to think about, is there a way, am I trying to measure too much at one time? Is there, what's the point of this assignment? That's a good time to go back to your learning objectives and kind of link the assignment to the objectives again. So you have your criteria, and now you need to write the differing level of performance. And this is probably one of the hardest parts of writing a rubric. It's really easy to write what a great, advanced, excellent student looks like, and it's really easy to write what a deficient or failing or below minimum competency looks like. It's hard to get the nuances of the levels in between. Something that's probably the most important part to write is what is minimum proficiency. So minimum proficiency would be minimum passing, so a 60%, or just above failing. I heard it described once as the embarrassment factor. So what could the student be able to do so that you wouldn't be embarrassed to tell your colleagues that they passed your class? So that is a difficult thing to really kind of wrap your mind around. But if you can do that, if you can say the student is deficient in all these areas, but they passed because they could do this, this, and this, then that would be your minimum proficiency. And then it's easy from there to say what's less than that or what's better than that. Another way that I have been showed how to do this is helpful is called a yes, yes, but, no. And this would be a 4-level rubric. And yes would be that they can do it. Yes, but kind of they can do it, but there's some problems. No, but means they didn't get it, but there might be some things they're doing right. And then no is they just didn't get it at all. So for example, if I was going to use this learning outcome to recommend the most appropriate cold medication to a patient, and I wanted to recommend a choice, my yes might be choose a medication. They chose a medication that addressed all of the patient's symptoms and met all of the patient needs. And by patient needs, we mean things like cost, how many times the patient has to take it a day, all the kind of the comfort factors, the non-symptom related factors. So it was appropriate and it was best choice for that patient. Yes, but might be it was an appropriate medication. It treated all their symptoms, but it probably wasn't the best in terms of that patient because another reason there was a cheaper option or something like that. No but might be they chose the wrong medication, but it addressed some of their symptoms. So they chose a medication that only addressed, say, one symptom, that they had a stuffy nose and they had a fever. So they're going to get some relief, but it wasn't the right medication. But it wasn't completely wrong either, because they'll get some relief. And then no might be they just chose the wrong medication. They gave someone, Tylenol for a runny nose or something completely inappropriate. So that's a nice way that I like to kind of play with the descriptions. But a word of warning, the yes but and the no but, sometimes when you're writing them, they tend to like reverse. And so you're just, for the no but, you're saying yes but in the negative. So just be careful of that there really is a difference between yes but and no but. Another common question is, how many levels should you have when you're describing performance? And obviously the minimum is 3. If it's 2 levels, it's a checklist. So 3 levels would be your minimum. And it really depends on what the differentiation is in your assignment and the things that typically the students do wrong. So this is where it helps to know where do students commonly make mistakes with the criteria, because if there's many places where they can, along the continuum where they mess up, then you're going to have more descriptors. But if there's really only a couple things that they do wrong, then you'll have some less descriptors. If you have an even number, then it kind of forces the grader to choose between yes or no, or the pass or fail, or whatever that middle line is. If you have an odd number, some people say everyone kind of goes towards the midline. So I don't know if that's important or not, but that's a consideration, I guess. Once you kind of get above 5 levels, 6 levels, it's too many. You really have to look at what are the nuances you're trying to describe. Are they real? Are they on a continuum? And even from just the level of grader, ease for the grader, it would be really difficult as a grader to keep all of these distinct 6 levels of performance in your mind as you're trying to go through an assignment and grade. So I would say, for me, 5 would probably be the most. And honestly, most of my rubrics are usually 3 or 4. So now you've written your draft of your rubric, and it's really important to do a quality check. So if you have past assignments that students have done, use it. I guarantee you will make edits and adjustments to it. So you can go through this process and it completely makes sense to you, but as soon as you use your rubric to grade a student, you're going to go back and make changes to it. Get peer feedback, give it to a couple colleagues, have them look through it, have them use it on their students if their students are doing the same thing. Even better, give it to your students. I've seen situations where you build the rubric with your students, and by the students really getting involved in understanding what's the criteria and what's the differentiations of that criteria, it's really good feedback for the student, and they learn what's important and kind of where they need to be. And I improve my rubrics every time I use them. Every class, every year I make a little note for next year, and I'm inevitably tweaking a rubric. So now I want to look at it in the opposite direction. And this is probably a lot more common. Most of us are using rubrics to some extent with something. I mean, they're all over the web, all different kinds of rubrics. So this is probably the situation you'll find yourself in more often. You're using a rubric and you probably need to be improved. How do you approach that? So it's kind of the opposite of what we just talked about. One thing you can look for is don't measure more than one criteria at a time. So kind of go through each of the criteria, read the descriptions, and see, are they really describing one criteria, one definable aspect? So this is an example of an assignment that students did to create kind of a presentation for the public in a health and wellness course. And if we just read across originality, they develop a project that's unique, specifically targeting a select population. The project presentation delivery is designed for a select population. And then the next one says develops a project targets a select population, and the presentation delivery is generic. So you can already see there's like 2 to 3 things floating around in here. There's the uniqueness of the project, there's the audience of the project, and then there is the delivery of the presentation. So, I mean, at a minimum, those are 3 things, and they're labeled under the criteria originality. So you need to kind of pull those 3 things apart and decide, are they all important? Because then they each need to be their own criteria. And if something is not important, then get rid of it. Or maybe it belongs under another criteria. Maybe it's just you're interpreting or mislabeling it here. Don't create criteria for non-essential features. So this is a biggie, and you'll find this on most rubrics. And it's hard because when we see assignments, we want to grade the assignment, and I think we need to then go back and think about what's the learning objective. So creating a rubric for neatness, or at least a criteria for neatness of an assignment, a design of the cover page, or how engaging the presentation was, or the format of the references, unless these are objectives of your course, then they should not be evaluated in the rubric if the rubric is, because it's not measuring what the student is learning, it's measuring how well they can follow directions. And so that's a little bit different. How you might deal with something like that, I think about this a lot. If the student, for example, does all their referencing wrong, how do you grade that? So that might be something that you might say, if it's referenced wrong, it's a redo. You have to read, it won't be accepted, so it's not an acceptable project. But technically, unless references are part of the assignment that you're going to be evaluating whether they can reference or not, shouldn't really be part of the rubric. Don't score by counting. So lots of rubrics do this, and it's not appropriate. For example, this was a rubric in an administration course where students were supposed to work in groups to create a business plan for a pharmacy. And so they needed all of these critical elements in the business plan, and on the rubric you can see that if they were missing 4 or more elements, missing less than 4, or they had all their elements. So that's not really the appropriate way to use the rubric. These are kind of directions in the assignment. This is what should be included, but you're not really evaluating how much they were evaluating really if they follow the directions or the completeness of the project. Don't score things that are not part of the rubric. This happens a lot too, especially when the criteria or the descriptions are not very clear. In this particular example, this was another example from lab where students were doing a simulation with a patient and doing a counseling session with a simulated patient. And so for professionalism, it was defined as, acted in a professional manner, eye contact, empathy, open posture. So really, these examples I'm sharing with you, they need a lot of improvement, but for the purposes of looking at not scoring things in this rubric, professionalism was defined as eye contact, empathy, and open posture. And then you can see it went and used kind of non-clear language and the rest. But the point of this is what we found when we went back and we looked into ExamSoft at the grader comments, which is a really useful feature to go back and see what your graders are putting in the comment boxes. They were writing things like, it appeared you didn't use a lot of effort, or you were really nervous and it affected your confidence, or you didn't use professional language. And so these were all important things for the session, but it's not professional as was defined in this rubric. So technically we were scoring things that weren't part of the rubric. So this, we ended up adjusting the rubric, making it either count or not count things that we thought were important to score the student for. But that is a really important thing, and you won't necessarily know that unless you get feedback from your graders. And that's where grader training comes in. Don't score the product. This is a big one because it's so fun to think about your assignment and then figure out what are the critical elements of your assignment, what are the criteria of your assignment. And it really goes back to the learning objective. So examples of this would be if I want students to, the assignment is to reflect on today's learning. So what did you learn in class today? Write a reflection. And what I'm really trying to do is see what you learned. But if my rubric then is, grading the stages of reflection, did you do the what, so what, now what, I'm not grading what you know, I'm grading can you write a reflection. Same thing, write a paper on the history of pharmacy. If my rubric is assess organization and spelling and length of the paper, it's not telling me, that information is not telling me what you know about the history of pharmacy. It's telling me about how you can organize and spell. And unless that's part of the learning objectives for my course, should not be part of the rubric. And finally, counseling a patient on the use of eye drops. And then assessing the patient on how they introduce themselves, their body language, their eye contact. Again, if this is part of the learning objective of the course, completely appropriate. If it's not, and you're trying to look at what does the student know about eye drops and how to use them, then these rubric criteria are inappropriate for that phase, or that function. Don't codify assignment directions. So this is, kind of overlapping with what we've talked about a little bit, but the assignment directions are the assignment directions. And if you put those then into the rubric, you're just assessing how well they can follow directions. You're not assessing what they've learned and how that links back to your learning objectives. So this is another example where students worked in groups to create a SOAP note. Those of you who don't know what SOAP notes are, they're kind of a standard way of documenting the thought process and decision-making and the care that a patient gets in the medical system. So they worked in groups, and they had a patient case that was very complex, and they had to, think about everything that they wanted to do and document it in a SOAP note. And then the SOAP note was graded. And part of the rubric was performance level, the contribution and participation. And so it was apparent that not all the students were working together, and they had conflict, and excellent is everyone was cooperative and everybody did equal amount of work. So this is excellent if you are assessing the ability of students to work in groups or teamwork, and maybe that's part of your assignment. But if the assignment was write a SOAP note because we want to see can you process and make decisions and get the right information, then this group work has no part of that actual rubric. And finally, don't evaluate. This is probably the most common type of rubric you'll see, and actually I just grabbed this off Google. I don't even know what it's trying to measure. It's the perfect example of what most simple rubrics look like. Excellent, very good, good, poor, complete, not complete, failure. Rubrics are not evaluations. The main function of a rubric is to be the bridge between the student performance and the judgment of their learning. So I'll say that again. The main function of a rubric is to match the student performance to the description, not judge it immediately, and then the description then becomes the bridge between the student work and the evaluation or judgment of that learning. So if your rubric becomes the evaluation, then you're not using it appropriately. You're taking out that middle step of what's the description that describes the evaluation. So if you see rubrics like this is a great example to go and say, okay, topic mastery, complete mastery of topic. Well, what does that mean? Clarity, like what might that look like? And I didn't put it in the slides, but those of you who are not familiar, AAC&U has something called a value rubrics. And if you just kind of Google value rubrics, they have wonderful, very well thought out rubrics in lots of different areas that are adaptable. For example, they have problem solving, they have teamwork, they have inquiry analysis, communication. So I go there often when I'm thinking about my assignments, thinking, okay, part of my assignment has a problem-solving aspect. Well, what are the components of problem-solving that I really should be looking for in this paper? And what should I be directing them to do in the assignment so that they know that this is part of what they need to do? So I very highly recommend everybody, bookmark that page and use those rubrics. And again, you want to do quality checks, so you've improved your rubric. Get some past work, grade it, see if it works or not, see if your improvements work. Another way to approach it is take student assignments and kind of put them in categories of what you would consider excellent, good, and poor, and then kind of start to describe why you think it's excellent, good, and poor. And kind of from this exercise, you'll be able to come up with what that criteria is, and then you'll have examples there of good pieces of work with that criteria and poor pieces of work. And that can really help write those descriptions, because you're using actual student work to describe why the good ones are good and why the bad ones are bad. So finally, what I would like to talk about is converting rubrics to grades. And this is a tricky subject. So rubrics are kind of designed to go along a continuum. But if that continuum doesn't match our current grading scheme, then the student grade will not be representative in the terms we're used to thinking about, which would be a percentile grade or a letter grade. So one way that you could think about the performance levels would be grades, A, B, C, D, and F. And another would be, say, proficiency levels, like C's, meets, needs improvement, significant deficiency. The most important thing, though, is you need to decide what's the minimum level of acceptability, either with these grades or with these terms. And the reason that you need to do that is because if you just set the rubric in ExamSoft with your categories and your levels, it will just calculate based on it will assume there's equal differences between all the levels and that everything is weighted equally. And I have some examples I'll show in a moment where that's not really the most appropriate way to do it. So we need to think about what's the minimum level of acceptability. We need to think about how to weight different criteria. For example, in a paper, topic selection, is that as important? Background, the analysis, and the content. Should some of those be worth more points for the student grade than others? And finally, we'll talk quickly about points versus the range of points, because ExamSoft does let you use both of those. So this is an example of student, who is our mock student that we give all kinds of exams to here. And this is kind of just a junk rubric. There's nothing real in it. But I wanted to show you that if you used a 3-point scale where 0 was failing, 1 was proficient, and 2 was advanced, if you didn't do anything to the performance levels or the weighting, a proficient student would get a 50%. And that might not be appropriate, and maybe that's appropriate, but it might not be appropriate if you're thinking about your A through F scale. Proficient probably should be more something like at least passing, so 60, maybe even higher, about 70. And if you make the rubric and then it converts all the grades, and you just import them into Blackboard or whatever your system is, and you don't think about this, then students will get really poor grades, and you can back it up with the rubric, but the grade, the number grade, or then when this is converted to a letter grade, which would be failing, a failing student doesn't mean a proficient student. Here's another example where instead of using 0, we used novice, advanced, and expert, and you can see the novice student ended up with a 33%. So again, maybe that's appropriate. So maybe students are supposed to start out novice at 33% and then move up towards expert throughout the course, but maybe this is not appropriate, and so you'd have to adjust the seating and the columns for that. So one way you can think about it is when you think about the letter scale, the A through F scale, it's a base 10 or decimal scale, so each performance category is not equidistant from the other. So A through D are equidistant, but D to F is not. And so how you might compensate for that is if you had failing at 0, but then minimum proficiency at 6. So for example, this represents a 60%. And then proficient might be 8, and then advanced might be 10. If you do this, then the numerical calculations will look a little bit closer to what you want when your number describes what your proficiency level is. when you're thinking about weighting, that's also very important. If you had, and I don't have it shown here, but if you had equally weighted rows here, or criteria for an introduction, an analysis, and a conclusion, then theoretically, someone who did a great intro but did a horrible analysis and conclusion, would get the same grade as somebody who did not so great an introduction but a great analysis and an okay conclusion. And that's probably not appropriate. So if you weight the criteria, so maybe, what to weight them is up to you. So for example, I might say the introduction is out of 100%, maybe it's 10% of the grade, and analysis is going to be 40% of the grade, and maybe conclusion is 20%. And you can, play with your numbers. This is what we do with grades all the time. What makes sense for the assignment? What makes sense for the student? But you can see if we do that, then this student who failed the introduction, but actually had a great analysis and a great conclusion, 83%. Which, that sounds okay. That kind of makes sense to me. And then this student who had a great introduction, but really the meat of the assignment pretty poor, they got a 66. And that kind of makes sense to me too. So if you think about the criteria across the top, and then the weighting of the performance levels across the top, and then the weighting of the criteria, test out your rubric and make sure that the student grade makes sense with the rubric levels, and that they all make sense with overall how you would have assigned a grade if you weren't using a rubric. The last thing you want to do is use a rubric if you were just grading it, subjectively, and give the student a B, and then the rubric is saying they get a D. That doesn't make sense. So then you need to go back and kind of play with things a little bit more. ExamSoft will let you do ranges instead of points, and as you can see up here, the difference is instead of giving these 1 point, you can say this column of excellent is 90 to 100. So this is the A column, and this is the B column, the 80 to 89, and this is the C column. And then instead of going in and clicking where the student is, you actually write their grade. You enter their grade in here. And so what the range does is it gives you a little bit more flexibility between scores. So if someone's introduction was an excellent A, maybe they get 100. And if someone's it met the criteria of excellent, but it just wasn't as wow as the other one, maybe they would get a 92 or 93. So it gives you a little bit of wiggle room. I guess it raises some red flags in my mind. If you have a lot of subjectivity and you're really using the ranges, then think about, is that one of those performance levels, is it hiding in there? So do you have two performance levels hiding that you can't just say you're this one or you're that one? If there's a range in there that is pretty significant, then maybe you need to change your rubric and expand it out a little bit. And again, the way this would grade the student is it just takes your grades at the end, it applies the weights, and then the student would get a total score at the end. So that was my little report on rubrics and what I think you should look out for them and how you can make them better. Hopefully, you'll now be able to recognize these flaws when you see rubrics, and you'll quickly want to scribble them out. I'm always doing that when I see a rubric, circling things that I think, and trying to make them flow better. Hopefully you have an idea now how to use some little techniques so you can make the descriptors between the characteristics a little bit more clear, and also clear between the levels of performance. Hopefully you have a better idea about how to assign the grades in ExamSoft and how to kind of play with them and make them more appropriate or more real to the student work. And hopefully overall, I've made my message clear that, rubrics evaluate learning, and if the assignment is not demonstrating student learning, then the rubric is not going to be measuring something that's valid. So really it comes down to, good pedagogy, good learning outcomes, good assignments that demonstrate that, and then good rubrics to measure student learning. So with that, I will end the webinar, and I'll take any questions.
Thanks so much, Aimee. What a great presentation. Really, really appreciate it. Everybody, we're going to go ahead and open up the forum for a Q&A session. We have quite a crowd today, so we will get through as many questions as humanly possible in the next 15 minutes or so. If you do have questions, now is the time to pose them through the questions area of the GoToWebinar control panel. Type them in there, and like I said, we will get to as many as humanly possible. So Aimee, I'm going to go ahead and dive right in, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay, great. First question is, would you recommend having similar criteria for both oral and for written assignments?
So I think that goes back to what are you trying to measure. If you're trying to measure oral presentation skills, and you know, then you're looking at a whole different set of criteria than you are when you're looking at written presentation skills. The things that are similar between those two assignments would be, assuming they're doing some kind of, you know, analysis and presentation on something, you know, it's going to be how did they find the information, how did they collate the information, how did they synthesize it into something new, what conclusions did they make. So those are the common things between the two. And so then I would use, then they can look very similar. And then the decision becomes, you know, which is the student preference or which is the more engaging way. How do you want to, you know, how do you want to grade that? Something else to consider is students tend to hate oral presentations, you know, so if the assignment itself, if the oral presentation impedes their ability to demonstrate their knowledge because they're nervous, you know, then you have to think, is that the best way for you to see if they know that? But if one of your learning objectives is to have them be able to, you know, speak publicly and do an oral presentation, then absolutely that would be the way to go, and you'd have different criteria for that.
Okay, next question is, do you think that rubrics should be standardized through a program?
So that is an excellent question, and I think it again kind of goes back to what is the point of your rubric, and we didn't really get into it too much, but there are holistic rubrics and there are analytic rubrics, and you know, rubrics can be used for different purposes. So if you had a more, I guess, holistic rubric that where you could describe kind of beginner performance and advanced performance, and you could accurately describe where the student was along that line, and then you wanted to use that either formatively or summatively to show student progression, then I think that would be very valuable. It would be something you'd have to, you know, be careful about how you did. Hopefully, if a grade was associated with it, that would be a problem, because then that means students that were the beginning students in your program would be getting poor grades. So it probably is not something you'd want to associate with a grade, or, you know, the grade of proficient for, say, for example, a first-year student would be, if they got a 30%, that would be 100% actually that translated onto their, you know, their grades or their GPA. So I do think that it is appropriate in some situations. But if you're trying to teach a student how to really kind of think critically, or I'm trying to think of something in the pharmacy world, like if when we're teaching a student to, say, interview a patient and then counsel them, students in the beginning make different mistakes than students that are later on in the program. And so our emphasis of what we're looking for changes. So in the beginning, it might be on more of the nonverbal skills and the ability to get the information. And later, it becomes more about, you know, how can they get that information efficiently and then be able to present it something back in an efficient manner. So in that situation, I wouldn't use the same rubric, because you're going to be looking for different things. So it's, I guess, kind of long-winded, but it depends what your purpose is.
Okay, great. Next question is, what is your recommendation on the pre-releasing of rubrics to students?
That again is it depends. So there's, I mean, these are great questions, and it really does depend. So if the rubric is something that will teach them how to think about something and will guide them how to learn, then it absolutely should be shared. But if the rubric is so kind of analytic and detailed that it gives them all the answers, I know that's something that we kind of come across in the health professions a lot, then maybe that's not something that you want to give out. If there are steps in a process and you want to see if they can do the steps appropriately, you might not want to share with them exactly, this is exactly what I'm going to be looking for under this criteria. But if it's something that's a little bit more evaluative or holistic, or even if you tell the student, I'm looking for analytical thinking and this is what it looks like, and this, that's not going to give them the answers per se, that's going to show think. So it depends on your rubric, and it depends on, I guess, the amount of information that you're willing to share with them. Will it help them learn? And I guess the line between will it help them learn versus does it give them all the answers, that can be tricky, and probably that would be something I would discuss with my colleagues. But in general, I always kind of side on the formative feedback. Students, they don't know what they don't know, and they don't know what your expectations are. And if you tell them what your expectations are, it will point them in a different direction. And does it really matter if you tell them how to do it right? If they then do it right, then they've learned it. So that's a good thing. So I kind of always err on the side of sharing.
Okay, great, thanks. Next question is, do you feel like there can ever be too many rows and or columns associated with a single rubric?
Yes, I absolutely do. It's too much rows or too many columns is just too complicated for the grader. And then what tends to happen is that, you score a couple assignments and, you use, say, imagine you had, 7 different dimensions across the top, and you use the 7 and the 6 and the 5 a lot. You're going to continue to use those numbers and stop looking at what the 6 means and the 3 and the 2. So I heard somebody, and I can't remember the exact number, but I heard somebody say once that there's a certain number of criteria that you can actually hold in your short-term memory at one time, and it's like something like 4 or 5 or somewhere around that, distinct pieces of information. So once you start to get too complicated with your dimensions, you can't hold all those dimensions in your head while you're reading it, so it's not really that useful. So I do think there can be too many dimensions. Too many criteria, I think there can be too many criteria, and I think you have to then go back to what's the point of the assessment? What are you trying to measure? And can you really measure all of that in this, whatever this one assignment the student is doing? All really important. You might go back at those rubrics and say, you know what, this is assessing the directions, this is assessing, kind of unimportant criteria. So you might be able to get rid of some of that criteria right off the bat, change it, make it shorter that way.
Great answer, thank you. Next question is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using rubric templates from outside of your discipline? So the disadvantages is that you can't just take it and use it because it probably is not applicable, it needs to be tweaked. The advantage is that it's so helpful sometimes to see how other disciplines word things and think about things. Those AAC and U rubrics, the value rubrics, are an excellent example. So I will take those rubrics and have, pretty detailed descriptors. And I won't use them exactly because the assignments that I would give in my course for a pharmacy student are not going to apply to that level of detail and or all of the criteria and the wording. But it's so helpful to see how they did that because I can take some of those words and I can make it apply to my own criteria and my own differentiation of the dimensions. So I don't know that you can directly apply them, but you absolutely, the advantages of opening your eyes that you weren't kind of seeing it before. Maybe it's a better way to look at a criteria or describe it. Okay, great. And two resource questions that we have, Aimee. One is I have had several people ask for you to repeat the website that you suggested to look for categorized rubrics.
Oh, that was AAC and U. AAC and U. It stands for, I can't remember right now, but the American Association of Colleges and Universities, I think. And if you just Google value rubrics, VALUE, they'll come up. And
Perfect.
you know, you can surf around their site and you can get to them.
Okay. That URL is also on the ExamSoft Twitter page. So if anybody is on Twitter, you can find it there as well. And then also a general resources question is, I have somebody asking, are there any other resources discussing the use of rubrics that you would like to recommend?
You know, there are some excellent books and some excellent websites. I don't know that I could recommend them off the top of my head, but I have seen some really good papers that, you know, for example, that talk about how the inequality of grading with a rubric, if you're not taking into consideration, you know, the difference between an F and a F and a D, and also, you know, there are some rubrics that can automatically calculate what the grading criteria or what the score should be in each box. ExamSoft will do that for you as well, but if you don't have the rubric function in ExamSoft and you're using rubrics, that can help. There's a lot of great information. There's a lot of kind of simple and not so great information too, so you kind of have to sift through it. But I don't know that I have one off the top of my head.
No worries. Thank you so much. That's going to wrap it up for us for today, everybody. We had a fantastic crowd, so I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of their afternoon to join us today. A couple of quick notes, because I did get questions about this as well. Yes, this webinar was recorded, so we will be sending out a link to the recording as well as a link to a PDF version of the slide deck within the next 48 hours, so keep an eye on your inbox for that. If you are an ExamSoft client and are interested in either trying out or using rubrics, please contact your CSS or account manager directly, or you can reach out to us generally at ExamSoft at info.examsoft.com if you need help as a client, or if you are not a client and would like more information, we're happy to send that out to you. Again, when you click out of the GoToWebinar control panel, you will get a pop-up with a quick 5-question survey. We would truly, really appreciate everybody taking just a couple of seconds to fill that out so that we can continue to provide relevant content. And that's going to be it. Dr. Strang, thank you so much for your presentation. This was really, really informative. So we appreciate you taking time to put this together for us and presenting.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Everybody have a fantastic week.